For over 1,000 years, one image has defined an entire people. Tall, fair-haired, blue-eyed, fierce warriors born from the frozen north. That is the Viking the world remembers. But in 2020, a team of scientists opened up the bones of nearly 500 Viking Age skeletons. And what they found inside the DNA did not match the legend at all. Some of the most feared Viking warriors in history were never Scandinavian at all. Not by blood, not by ancestry, not in any genetic sense. This is the story of what really happened when science finally looked past the myth. It is the story of who the Vikings actually were, where they truly came from, and why the answer is stranger and darker than anything written in the old sagas. For centuries, the picture was simple. The Vikings were a single people, a pure Scandinavian bloodline, farmers and raiders from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, who shared one language, one culture, and one ancestry. They set sail, they conquered, they spread their blood across Europe. That was the story historians told for generations. Norse warriors, and Norse warriors alone, building an empire of fear from Dublin to Kiev. It was a clean story, a proud one. It gave modern Scandinavians a straight line back to the warriors of the sagas. It gave the rest of the world a simple villain and a simple hero wrapped into one. It was also almost entirely wrong. In September of 2020, a team led by geneticist Eske Willerslev, working across the universities of Cambridge and Copenhagen, published the largest ancient genome study of the Viking world ever conducted. It had taken nearly 10 years to build. The team sequenced DNA from 442 human skeletons. They pulled these remains from Viking Age burial sites across Scandinavia, the British Isles, Iceland, Greenland, Poland, Russia, and Ukraine. The goal was simple. Read the actual genetic code of the Viking world and compare it to the myth. What the DNA showed first was a surprise on its own. Long before the Viking raids even began, foreign ancestry was already flowing into Scandinavia. Genetic material from southern Europe, genetic material from the east. Populations that had never been part of the Viking story were already inside Scandinavian bloodlines before a single longship ever left the shore. But that was only the first crack in the myth. The deeper the researchers dug, the stranger the picture became. The study found that Scandinavia itself was never one unified genetic population. There were clear differences between people from southern Scandinavia and people from the north. Diversity was highest in the south. Gene flow between different Scandinavian regions was surprisingly limited. In other words, the very idea of a single unified Viking bloodline started to fall apart before the Vikings even left home. Then the researchers traced where the Viking expansions actually went and who was moving where. Danish ancestry surged into England. Swedish ancestry moved east into the Baltic region. Norwegian ancestry spread out toward Ireland, Iceland, and Greenland. Each raiding culture followed its own separate path. Not one Viking people. Several distinct, only loosely connected populations, each with their own destination, their own mixing, their own story. The genome data revealed something else researchers did not expect to find so clearly. The physical traits we associate with Vikings today were not fixed the way we assume. By comparing Viking Age genomes to modern Scandinavian genomes, the team found that the genes controlling skin, hair, and eye pigmentation had shifted noticeably over the last 1,000 years. The blonde hair and pale eyes we picture when we hear the word Viking were not uniform even then. Pigmentation across Scandinavia was more varied in the Viking Age than it is today. The image in our heads, it turns out, was smoothed out by time, not preserved by it. The DNA also carried evidence of ordinary survival pressures working alongside the raids and the sagas. Researchers traced the spread of the gene that allows adults to digest milk, a trait known as lactase persistence, moving through the population at a pace fast enough to suggest real survival advantage. They found immune-related genes shifting too, the invisible arms race between human bodies and disease that never makes it into any saga, but shaped who lived long enough to have children of their own. History remembers the sword. The genome remembers the milk, and the immune system, and the 1,000 quiet pressures no poet ever wrote about. There is one more thread this research pulled on, one that turns the Viking story from myth into something closer to tragedy. Beginning around the year 980, Norse settlers crossed the open ocean and built a colony on the coast of Greenland. They raised cattle. They built churches. They lasted for over 400 years, farming a landscape at the very edge of what the human body can survive. Then sometime around 1440, they vanished. No mass grave, no record of final collapse, just silence and abandoned farms, and a colony that stopped appearing in any record at all. The genetic and archaeological evidence points to a combination of causes. Shifting trade relationships back in Europe, political changes in Scandinavia that cut the colony off from support, and a climate that was turning colder and harsher with every passing decade. The Vikings who conquered half of Europe could not survive the one place that gave them no one left to raid. Picture the world these people were sailing into. A coastal village on the Norwegian fjords sometime around 800 CE. Longhouses built low against the wind, smoke curling from the roof holes, fishing boats resting on wet black stone, children speaking a language that will one day become Old Norse, men preparing to sail west toward islands they have heard about only in traders' stories. They do not think of themselves as one people called Vikings. That word is not even their word for themselves. It describes what they do, not who they are. It means something closer to raiding or going on expedition. A season's work, not a bloodline, not a nation. That distinction turns out to matter more than anyone expected, because here is the twist that changes everything the genetic data revealed. In Orkney, off the northern coast of Scotland, archaeologists uncovered skeletons buried in unmistakably Norse fashion. Full Viking swords laid beside the bodies, grave goods arranged in the exact ritual style of Scandinavian warriors. Every visible sign pointed to Norse identity. Every artifact said Viking. Then the researchers sequenced the DNA. The genetic ancestry inside those bones was not Scandinavian at all. It matched local British populations, people who had never set foot in Norway or Denmark, people whose ancestors had lived on those islands for generations, long before any Norse ship arrived. These were not Scandinavian warriors buried far from home. These were local people buried as Vikings, dressed as Vikings, honored as Vikings, carrying swords like Vikings. But genetically, they were something else entirely. Being a Viking, it turns out, was never really about where your ancestors came from. It was about which world you chose to belong to. The same study uncovered something else almost as unsettling. In several burial sites, researchers found groups of Viking Age skeletons who were closely related to each other, not just distant kin, brothers, close family. Entire war bands built not from strangers united by cause, but from actual bloodlines, fighting and dying side by side. One researcher on the project put it simply, maybe you just brought your family along when you went on a raid. Somewhere in northern Europe, over 1,000 years ago, a group of brothers stood on a beach preparing to board a ship together, not knowing that their bones would one day answer a question no one alive at the time had thought to ask. Who were the Vikings, really? Think about what that means for the wider picture. A warband that looks, from the outside, like a random collection of hardened raiders might actually be a family. A father, his sons, a cousin or two, held together not just by loyalty but by blood, sailing into the same storms, raiding the same coastlines, and in many cases, dying within days of each other, buried together in the same foreign ground. The sagas turned these men into legends. The genome turned them back into families. The DNA does not just rewrite where the Vikings came from. It rewrites what the word Viking ever meant. Not a race, not a bloodline sealed off from the rest of the world. A culture, an identity, something people were born into, but also something people could step into, adopt, and be buried inside of, even if their blood told a completely different story. For over 1,000 years, we told this history backward. We assumed the sword and the burial and the ship meant blood. The genetics say otherwise. They say identity moved faster than ancestry ever did. They say a Pictish farmer on a Scottish island could become, in every way that mattered to the people around him, a Viking. That is the dark secret hiding underneath one of history's proudest legends. The warriors we imagined as a single fierce, unbroken bloodline were something far more complicated. Raiders and traders and settlers from different corners of Europe, pulled into the same violent, restless world, and given the same name, whether their blood matched the legend or not. The ships are gone now. The longhouses have collapsed into grass and stone, but the bones remained, waiting 1,000 years for someone to finally ask them the right question. And when science finally did, the answer was not the one anyone expected. The Vikings were never simply what the sagas told us. They were never a single people, sealed inside one bloodline, spreading across the world by blood alone. They were a world in motion. A door anyone could walk through if they were willing to pick up the sword and pay the price the sea demanded in return. And the deeper question the DNA leaves behind is this. If identity could move that freely 1,000 years ago, if a stranger's bones could be buried as a warrior's, wearing a name that was never his by blood, how much of what we think we know about any ancient people is written in the ground, and how much was only ever written in the story we chose to believe?